Raising the Conversation, a podcast by the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College, with your host Joel Murphy, facilitator of trend research and analysis here at the MacRae Centre.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Excited for today's conversation. We're speaking with Ryan Marthinsen, who is the lead pastor at Priory Park Baptist Church in Guelph, Ontario, where he started in 2023. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. His pastoral calling is to build intergenerational churches where children, youth, adults, and seniors together are spiritually formed and empowered to serve in the kingdom of God. Ryan lives in Guelph with his wife, Diana, and his two kids. And we've crossed paths a few different times with the different workshops, as well as together when we were at Assembly. But I've really appreciated whenever I have a chance to chat with Ryan about, and just to hear his enthusiasm, his passion, and his genuine heart to be able to support people in ministry, but also in Guelph. So Ryan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Excited. So our first question, this is kind of the question we've been asking, is looking at the idea of thinking about the future as Christian leaders. And so why do you think it is important for Christian leaders today to pay attention to the future, and how has that shaped your own leadership or imagination?
Well, I mean, thinking of the future is essential. I think we're always doing that in some sense, even if the future is just like next month, what am I preaching on kind of thing from a pastor's perspective. So just even from a pastoral leader's perspective, I think it's just natural for us to look, a few months down the line and say, where am I taking our congregation? And even with the individual, right? Like we're naturally forward thinking, talking with someone, they're pouring out their heart and they're saying, okay, what does this person need? How can I help this person meet God this week, next week, and to the future? So I think we're, as a people who are secure in our identity in Christ, we are still called to bring his mission and his good news into the world. And so thinking about the future is just that same process, just brought to sort of to an extended degree. Because at first you start thinking, well, what's my sermon series next year? But then you start thinking, what's my sermon series a year from now? And what's my church going to look like 5 years from now? And then what are we doing to look after this generation or that generation? How are we caring for those kids that are coming up? And so I think it's just such a natural thing, starting from pastoral leadership, that's my role, but then the church in general, like having all generations present in the church. I think it just brings that natural question of how are we going to spiritually care and form those who are coming up. And just from a practical standpoint, we just realize how fast society is shifting. I think we just all know that society is going to be different. Like, we weren't talking about AI before the pandemic, and now AI is everywhere. Like, I think we just know that the world 5 years from now is just going to be different. And so I think many of us choose to take that on intentionally. Say, I'm not just going to be this passive observer what culture's doing around me. I'm going to try to look forward and try to catch what the culture's doing to be relevant to all generations and to be able to make sure that the church has a voice in the lives of young people, but also all generations, because this is something that impacts from birth to senior and all the way in between.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think as you're talking, I'm always curious about there, like you said, there's so much change happening around us, and there's so much uncertainty, and like the language that we've been using out of the Futuring Hub is this kind of age of instability. How do you, and this connects kind of with our second question around, like, as you think about kind of the context that we're in with all this instability, with this uncertainty, with this rapid pace of change, like, how do you, like, what theological perspectives or scripture, like, helps to frame your approach to actually continuing to think about the future of both of your congregation, but of the communities you're involved in? Because I think at times it can feel exhausting or overwhelming to even be like, I'm just barely thinking about this Sunday, let alone next, like this sermon series this Sunday versus next year's sermon series, to be really practical in terms of a pastoral role. How do you like what has framed your perspective towards that?
Well, I think it's always for me a both and, because the last thing I want to do is start crying like the sky is falling. Like, we serve a God who has already won. Like, he is on his throne. Like, there is no defeating the God who has already conquered and will conquer. He is just, so that security allows me to know that no matter what is happening, there's no desperation, though we sometimes might feel tempted to feel that, especially in our particular churches where we might be struggling with very particular, issues like whether or not our church will even be surviving in the next year or the year after. So those things can tempt, but in any case, I always try to remember that God is on his throne, God is with us. And I think actually the pandemic really helped solidify that for me. I think, like many of us, we saw our churches sort of decline during that time. And while many folks are still reeling from that, the perspective I gained from that was, look how we still survived through that. Like, in a different form, and sure, maybe there's fewer people coming, but there are people still wanting to know about the Lord. There are new people still yet coming to our churches. Every church would, whether it was 1 or 50, right? Like, we all have people wanting to know Jesus. And so it's like, we can still survive the decline because God is going to survive it all. So, in one hand, I hold the security of the gospel, that it's not about me, it's about him, and he's the one in control. But on the other hand, it's the Great Commission. It's knowing that we are still yet people to be called to be sent out. It's being fishers of people, as Jesus called the disciples from Matthew 4 and other passages. Go, I'm gonna call you to send you out. It's that passage, and this is where I'm going to be I'm going to show my very poor pastor card here. I don't remember the exact reference, but there was a folk, I think it was the Bereans, who they were known to know the times. Not the Bereans, it was a different, anyway, it was like, there's a passage here where they were known to know the times and discern the times well, and not just know the scripture, but know the times. There you go. You can insert into the actual
I think it
verse
was Men
reference.
of Iscariot, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
Wasn't the Bereans. Bereans were the ones who knew the word, and actually they were the ones that also are inspirational there. If we ground ourselves in the gospel, but then know that it's also important for us to see the times, I think that's where my perspective comes. So I'm not one of these, everything has to be new for the sake of new, like this young pastor coming in telling us all we have to technologify everything. No, we bring it in appropriately, but also intelligently, because we know that we have to engage all generations, the young generations, the digital spaces. People are asking questions about AI. People are asking about being disciples in this time. We engage those while being rooted at the same time in the gospel. So that's kind of where my perspective lies, and it kind of lies in a both and.
I love that. Like I think that's actually a really lovely distinction and a helpful thing because when I've talked to people about why we think about the future and the value of it, it's the struggle of, well, we just have to trust, right? And God is ultimately in control. And yes, this is true. We can hold that. But like you're saying, and we are a commissioned people, we are called, we are empowered, we grow in wisdom and discernment. Both of those can be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I Just to add in on that, I
Yeah.
just feel like to go too strong on the we just have to trust, I think is not actually reading the Bible well. Because if everyone in Scripture, if the book of Acts could have been very short. It could have been, well, everyone just trusted God and they stayed exactly the same size. But no, it was they added to their number daily those were being saved. Why? Because they trusted God to be sent out,
Mm,
to bring the message to the world. And in our world, we do the same. We can trust God, but also it's not about a necessity per se, but it's more like, what if we actually responded to what God was enabling us to do? What more fruit can we bear for God's kingdom? Not because we have to, but because we get to join in this wonderful journey of reaching the world, as the book of Acts and the whole Bible was telling a story of.
right. Yeah, and with the wisdom of like kind of like Paul contextualizing the way this is your unknown God. This is like right, like that idea of
Of
knowing
course.
the times allows us to then be able to engage in it that way.
Of course.
Yeah, love that. Could you I feel like we could talk forever. That's fine. Could you share a moment or a practice or experience where you engaged in like engaged in something or thinking about the future and how it helped you or your community see something new or maybe possible steps to take forward in terms of this is we're thinking about the future and then because of this thinking we resulted in this action.
Well, so this is going to be a bit of a microcosm because admittedly our church, we haven't yet really engaged the big futuring questions. Um, but just even in just this small example of seeking, so one thing we did recently as a church is we never had a paid worship director. Our church always relied on volunteers for its entire history. We're not an old church. We were open about in 71. We always relied on them. But in this season, just due to the pandemic and everything, we don't have that key volunteer that can just coordinate music. And so thus we had no music other than what we could digitally provide. So we as a leadership engaged in our own little version of futuring. It was a micro futuring. It's like, where do we want to see our church in a few years, and how do we build that? Recognizing that, people of all ages, but especially young people, desire music. Music is a key way that lots of people will engage. One aspect of future. One of my friends who works in worship ministry local, he says one of the things you can say is you just go to any one of these kind of worship, like regional worship nights that I don't know if in Nova Scotia you have them. We have them here in the Waterloo region, and take a look at the demographic that attends these worship nights. It's largely young people. So I'm sure I'm speaking to your point where sometimes futuring is also just looking at the now. Like if you just open your eyes and see that the church desires this thing, that there's a hunger for this that will play out in the future. And so in our little futuring discussions, we thought, having music is going to be a very key part of not just our own personal growth, because again, it's not about growth, it's not about numbers, but about adding richness to our church that a young person might come to us and see and not see a red flag in a lack of a music ministry. So we just took the time to look at what our priorities were, what we could do with this, and we, used some funds, extra funds that we had in order to invest in this. It was a big kind of question mark, and even yet it still is. We're still less than a year into this project, and we're seeing, of course, it has a budgetary impact.
Yep.
We did it is a trusting move kind of thing, but we're doing it with a sort of this sense of hopeful expectation that God will show us what will happen with this. And so I think that's a template for a lot of different kinds of futuring things. It's like, let's notice what's happening. Let's notice where we feel God is sending us. And this is where the trust piece comes. Trust that if we make this investment, or we make this leap into the unknown, that God will, at the very least, teach us a good lesson. Because that's ultimately one of the ways that I sort of present this to my leadership. It's saying, even if we fail, we're not actually failing, because we would have just been experiencing what's called a learning experience from the Lord.
Yeah.
I hear the call to just trust, but I wonder if sometimes we are tempted to think that trusting in that sense, that stagnant trusting, is really just not listening. And if we actually listen to where God is leading us, even if it does turn out differently than we expected, maybe the thing God had needed for us to do was learn that lesson in the first place.
I think that is brilliant. I think that like the idea of a lot of the time when you think about futuring, right, you say like it's what's happening in the future, but really it's a large part of it, at least in my perspective, is that sense making, that contextual, what is happening? What are the patterns, the trends that are happening today? And then what does that then mean for us in our context and how do we want to respond? Like I think it's an awesome example. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate the emphasis on like trust and like willingness to risk, right? Like it is there's a financial challenge, but like commitment around with like what you're talking about, but we know that it's kind of like an adaptive mindset, right? Or a growth mindset. We are going to try this thing and we're going to learn through it, and it's ultimately going to make us better as a faith community, which is remarkable, actually.
We're doing our best.
Well, and that's all you can do, right?
Of course.
When things are so crazy. Yeah, the final kind of question I would like to wrap up with, and I feel like there's so much richness and like just really practical insights to what you're saying, so I really appreciate it. Um, but when you think about when you're thinking about the future, I guess practically the question is like, what gives you hope? And then what encouragement would you offer to leaders who are maybe feeling uncertain about what lies ahead? I'm feeling, as I hear you talk, there's a lot of energy and openness. Like we are trying things, and this is what we're doing. So how would you encourage people to do that, or what is the hopeful? And you kind of articulated a little bit already in terms of what you have hope in, but when you think about the future.
Yeah. I mean, my hope comes from a place that I would admit I'm a little privileged to feel this way because, of course, I don't have my own home church community or livelihood based on one particular church. Um, my hope just comes in the gospel. My hope comes with the fact that Jesus, as I said before, is on his throne, is in control of everything. I feel like where we are tempted to feel lack of hope, and I say this with all respect to the many people who are in the trenches in this regard. I feel like sometimes our lack of hope comes from mismatched expectations with what God's expectations might be. Like, I have a healthy sense that God's God's future may not involve our church, Priory Park Baptist Church. Like it may not. If Priory were to close next year, would that be a huge impact for the kingdom? Well, perhaps in some way, but will God be shaking in his boots? Will God not know what to do as a result of our church closing? I'm sure there's disappointment when followers of Jesus are not listening to him, and as a result, ministries close. But I don't see God shaking his boots and wondering what is he going. He's just going to send others in our place, and so my hope is not in the continuation of our church. Like if I ever catch people thinking that way, I try to gently remind people that God, our hope is not in our church. Our hope is in the kingdom.
Mhm.
Even if we were to close and all the faithful believers were to go to different churches, they would just bless those churches. The church in Guelph would still be animated, maybe even more animated because they'd have a newfound fire, right? Like God won't take that as a step back. Um, and for myself, I mean, this is where I'm a little privileged. We are in a season where we're in a pastor shortage, right? Just being being honest, like it, I don't feel as desperate to need to keep my job here because I feel, and maybe next year it will change, right? So I'm not here saying, oh, I'm always going to be high and mighty on this and always going to have because we know that churches are probably going to be continuing to close. And maybe we will find a season where it is harder and harder for me to find the next job. So
Mhm.
even while I say for right now I'm good, I think at the same time I do still feel that sense that God will take care of me.
Mhm.
Even if it won't, even if pastoring for me will look completely different in 10 years, where it does have to look very different, where it's even more difficult for even me to find that full-time pastoring job. Like I feel like God will show me what that new reality is going to look like. And so that's where the hope comes from. It comes from knowing that my hope is not in having a job. My hope is not in having this church survive. My hope is in Jesus. My hope is in his kingdom. And the more I remind myself of that, because I can get tempted to go back to those very defensive places, but the more that allow God to remind me of where my hope is, that's what gives me hope for the future. So all of this AI stuff, all of the doom and gloom that is said about this stuff, I mean, I accept that there might be challenges, but it doesn't make me lose hope. I feel
Mhm.
like God is going to show us the way, and we're going to be singing joyfully for eternity together as brothers and sisters as a result. So it doesn't shake me.
I I think that is a wonderful way to wrap up this conversation. And I think just a beautiful image of thinking about we can hold things with a certain amount of levity with intentionality. We can use our gifts and our wisdom and all these pieces. But like you said, it's almost a demonstration of humility and recognition that we are a part of something that is bigger than just our own little kingdom, our own little cells. There's something bigger, which fills me with hope too, as you talk about that.
Yeah, and I of course don't want to make myself out to be this like super pastor who is always doing like I have my down days, and I think it's having those rhythms to be able to have people speaking into your life, the right people, find those places where even as a pastor you find yourself humbled, so that you're not drinking your own Kool-Aid all the time, that you have regular rhythms in your life to remember that, you know, th- there God is the one really that is in charge of this whole thing.
Mm, that's amazing. Well, Ryan, I really appreciate it. I appreciate your willingness to chat and your insights, and I think it's really offers a really great perspective for us to think about and sit in around how do we approach this future in really, really wonderful ways. So thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.